In Search of Answers. In his book Apocalypse Never, Michael Shellenberger criticizes environmental alarmism, which is the systematic exaggeration and misrepresentation of facts surrounding environmental issues such as climate change. Last couple of lectures I discussed his take on deforestation, plastic pollution, extinction, and sweatshops. He thinks that much of the rhetoric from environmentalists surrounding these issues is alarmist. Today we will look at the issues of fracking, food, and nuclear waste. Let's start with fracking, which is the use of hydraulic fluids in the recovery of otherwise unrecoverable natural gas and oil packets trapped in shale rock formations deep in the Earth's crust. There's quite a bit of gas and oil trapped in rocks in small packets. Indeed, conventional oil and gas is probably a small fraction of all reserves. That means fracking enables us to access an enormous amount of fossil fuels that was previously beyond our reach and therefore beyond our ability to burn and turn into energy and greenhouse gases. Here's how fracking works. First, the oil company drills a well. When the drill bit reaches the layer where the trapped oil and gas is located, it is turned 90 degrees and starts drilling horizontally, which could continue for several miles. Once drilling is complete, the workers on site start pumping fracking liquid into the well. This liquid is made out of more than 99% water and sand and about 0.5% additives. We will get to these additives in a bit. But it is important to note that the amount of fracking liquid used is not small. Depending on the size of the well, it could add up to several million gallons. Once the well is completely filled, hydraulic pumps on site start applying very high pressures on the liquid. The pressure gets so high it exceeds the compressive strength of the highest quality concrete. This fractures the shale rocks, hence the name fracking. It also frees the oil and gas packets that were trapped in the rock. Next, these freed packets are all pumped back up to the surface and recovered. This all sounds kind of neat. You might be asking, what is the big deal? Why do people complain about fracking? The main problem is wastewater. Remember those millions of gallons of fracking liquid that were pumped into the well? What do we do with it? It's not clean. It's not only mixed with oil residue, but also has a bunch of additives I mentioned earlier, some of which are toxic. The cost of treating this water and making it clean enough to be dumped into a waterway is prohibitively high. That's why most of the wastewater is left on the ground inside the well. The problem is that's also where most drinking water comes from. If the fracking wastewater contaminates the groundwater, that would be a disaster. To make matters worse, there's very little regulation on what goes into these wells. Remember those additives? In the United States, there is no legal requirement for oil and gas companies to disclose what they are. Some companies voluntarily disclose some of the information, but some additives are kept as trade secrets. Shellenberger, however, thinks that the dangers of fracking are overblown. First, he correctly points out that so far there is no evidence of groundwater contamination. Second, he argues that fracking generates large quantities of natural gas, which is the cleanest fossil fuel. I'd like to hear what you think about these. But in case you would like to learn more about fracking, I'm linking a few articles and sources in the video description. Next item on the list is food, in particular animals as food. As you might remember, close to half of all habitable land on Earth is used for raising animals for food. Environmentalists tend to oppose most forms of animal agriculture. A big part of this is due to the inefficiency of animal agriculture relative to plant agriculture. I won't repeat the figures, but here they are in case you need a refresher. But one statistic worth repeating is the fact that livestock is responsible for almost 15% of global emissions. Shellenberger thinks that those who call for reducing or completely abolishing animal agriculture based on such environmental concerns are being alarmists. As we will see, Shellenberger has many arguments, some of which, oddly, have little to do with the environment and engage concerns about human health and animal welfare instead. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and examine his arguments one by one. First, Shellenberger points out the fact that sometimes the health benefits of vegetarianism and veganism are exaggerated. Shellenberger's take on the effects of plant-based diet on human health seem to be based on cherry-picked evidence. Indeed, all meta-analyses I could find support the conclusion that, on the whole, plant-based diets are better. Indeed, a meta-analysis by Medawar et al. States there is an overall robust support for beneficial effects of a plant-based diet on metabolic measures in health and disease. We shouldn't exaggerate, of course. There are lots of risks associated with plant-based diets. For instance, most plants are poor in vitamin B12 and iron. B12 is a macronutrient. We need about 1.5 micrograms of it a day. B12 deficiency is a serious condition that can cause permanent cognitive impairment. It's extremely rare among meat eaters because B12 is found in meat, dairy, and eggs in sufficient quantities. But B12 is not found in fruits and most plants. According to one study, which I'm linking, 77% of lacto-ovo vegetarians and 92% of vegans have B12 deficiency. Sounds scary, but these statistics apply to only those who do not take multivitamin pills. Indeed, regularly using an over-the-counter multivitamin supplement reduces B12 deficiency risk to virtually zero. Iron deficiency is a bit harder to manage, although it is less serious. Our bodies need iron to bind respirated oxygen and carry it to our muscles and vital organs. Iron deficiency can cause anemia, low blood pressure, chronic fatigue, and momentary loss of consciousness, which could sometimes be life-threatening due to the risk of falling and sustaining head injury. Especially red meat has significant quantities of iron, so iron deficiency is less common among meat eaters. Females are especially prone to iron deficiency, and the risk is higher among vegetarian females. Treating iron deficiency and the resulting anemia is a bit more complicated than preventing B12 deficiency. This is so because our guts are very good at absorbing iron. Plus, beverages such as coffee and tea reduce absorption even further. As a result, many patients have trouble rectifying their iron deficiency with dietary supplements. There are options, however. Iron infusions, which are periodic intravenous injections of iron, work for most people. Clearly, I'm not your doctor. I'm not trying to give you medical advice. Obviously, you should talk to your doctor if you have iron deficiency or at a risk for it. I'm saying this because for more than a decade of teaching food ethics, I have met hundreds of students who told me that they can't be vegetarian because of anemia. Not a single one of them knew about iron infusions. I do not want to sound judgmental, but the most plausible inference to draw in such cases is anemia is just a rationalization to continue eating animals. If it weren't just a rationalization, these people would have at least explored their options. Another risk associated with plant-based diets is decreased intestinal biodiversity. Varied diets support better gut bacteria. However, this is not a huge concern. The science of gut bacteria is, to put it diplomatically, not very robust. The quality of evidence leaves a lot to be desired. What is more, this concern cuts both ways. Most meat eaters have bad gut faunas because they don't eat enough plants and soluble fiber. So at worst, this is a small concern that recommends a small amount of meat intake. At best, it's a measurement noise that has no empirical significance. Finally, there is the risk of increased fructose intake. Shellenberger presents this as a significant issue, and it is. Fructose is a naturally occurring sugar that is found in fruits, including corn. However, naturally occurring is misleading. Since humans first domesticated fructose-bearing plants, they increased the fructose content substantially. For instance, apples were domesticated by Europeans for the first time in the Middle Age. Back then, apples tasted like raw potatoes because the fructose content was less than 1% of what it is now. An even more dramatic transformation happened to corn. On the left, you see wild corn, which is the plant Native Americans first domesticated about 10,000 years ago. It was a plant with a few hard and starchy seeds that had to be boiled for hours to be edible. On the right, you have the modern corn, which contains not only larger and much softer seeds, but also about 1,000 times more fructose. What makes increased fructose intake a problem is this. Since fructose was very rare, we didn't evolve to deal with it. When digested by humans, fructose behaves like other sugars in terms of energy and fat generation, but it doesn't stimulate the brain mechanisms responsible for satiation. If you ate more than a small amount of glucose, you would get sick and throw up. But you can gulp down a pint of fructose syrup and want more. This is only the tip of the iceberg. Indeed, there is evidence that fructose is as addictive as alcohol. What does this have to do with vegetarianism? Many people who try vegetarianism and veganism fill the gap in their diet that was created by abandoning animal products by eating foods high in simple sugars, especially fructose. They often do this without realizing because fructose is so abundant both in domesticated fresh fruits and in processed foods. It is very hard to avoid it. So Shellenberger has a point here. His point, however, is a little bit overshadowed by his defense of factory farming. Indeed, there are serious health risks associated with factory farming which he doesn't bring up. At some factory farms, for instance, animals are fed old food, which comes in plastic packaging and is put through a grinder to make feed. My goal isn't to disgust you. If you are curious, just Google plastic in animal feed, and there will be many videos to satisfy your curiosity. The problem with this is the fact that some of the waste material crosses the intestinal barrier and ends up in the animal's tissue, milk, and eggs. This might in part explain why people with meat-based diets are more prone to certain types of cancer. Second, factory farms crowd animals in unnatural concentrations. This makes infectious disease a serious problem. To counteract this problem, factory farms use large amounts of antibiotics. Indeed, we see a significant increase in the amount of antibiotic use in factory farms. This is due to antibiotic resistance, which is the bacteria causing infectious disease getting more resilient against the antibiotics and requiring larger doses over time to be killed. Yet this is not a problem hurting just animals. Many of the bacteria that causes illness in animals also cause illness in humans. Antibiotic resistance might soon be so high, infectious disease, which was the leading cause of death before the discovery of antibiotics, can become again one of the big killers. And finally, there is the risk of a new zoonotic disease. A zoonotic disease is a disease that originates from animals and infects humans. The chances of this happening is directly proportional to the number of animals we raise and interact with. If we continue to raise and eat animals by the billions, as we do now, sooner or later we will have a new zoonotic disease which could, as we witnessed in 2020, kill millions of humans and cause all sorts of other harm to humans. Next, Shellenberger makes the argument that factory farming lets more animals to be alive at a given time. There is definitely truth to this. First, domestication changed farm animals significantly and reduced their fitness. If we were to stop farming animals and let them loose in the environment, they would likely go extinct or at least become endangered. This is the red jungle fowl, a tropical bird from which chickens were domesticated. As you can see, even free-range chickens are substantially fatter than red jungle fowls. They simply stand no chance against predators like raccoons, foxes, and coyotes. Besides, modern chickens have significantly smaller brains than their ancestors because we have been selectively breeding them to be more docile. Again, this makes their chances of surviving in the wild much lower. The same applies to sheep. This is a wild sheep species living in North America. And this is a domesticated sheep. The same story. Fatter body, shorter legs, smaller brain. They are clearly not as fit to survive in the wild. Based on these facts, Shellenberger considers an argument in defense of factory farming. Here's how it goes. About 1.6 billion animals live in factory farms in the United States alone. Matching this figure without factory farming is grossly infeasible. In fact, all small farms put together amount to less than 10 million animals. Having more animals alive at a time indicates elevated moral value. Therefore, factory farming is morally superior to small farms. I would like to hear what you think about this argument. Does it address the moral qualms some people have with factory farms? Next, Shellenberger makes two claims about treating animals as food. Killing animals isn't as bad as killing humans, and animals can be happy in factory farms. I'm not sure why he makes the first point because I think most people would concede it and find it irrelevant. Robbery isn't as bad as murder, but that doesn't mean that robbery is morally acceptable. Similarly, the idea that killing animals isn't as bad as killing humans doesn't establish the moral permissibility of killing animals. The more interesting part of his claim is the second part. Animals can be happy in factory farms. Indeed, there is a common misconception among consumers that free range means happy. This is a free range chicken. As you would notice, there are large sores on its legs and back. This is the result of putting chickens in flocks that are too big. Chickens evolved in flocks that are small. Forcing them to be a part of a flock larger than approximately 80 chickens causes constant fighting and pecking. Red jungle fowl solves this problem by splitting a flock every time the flock is getting too big. Indeed, mothers encourage their chicks to leave the flock and start their own around 12 months of development. In many so-called free-range farms, the flock size is in the hundreds if not thousands. This results in chickens pecking at each other constantly. Factory farms prevent this problem by debeaking chicks, which is cutting off part of a baby chicken's beak with a hop blade. That way, they can't injure each other. Unfortunately, Shellenberger fails to mention the practice of debeaking and the evidence that it causes chronic pain. However, on the whole, he seems to be right. When we measure the stress hormones in factory-farmed and free-range chickens, we don't see any difference. Both groups seem equally miserable. Next, Shellenberger makes an environmental argument based on economics. He claims that the rebound effects of switching to vegetarianism would make it a wash, environmentally speaking. A rebound effect is a consumer behavior involving increased consumption following a short period of decreased consumption due to eliminating an expenditure. Here's an example you might have witnessed yourself. You have a friend who's addicted to Starbucks. She buys several expensive lattes every day, which adds up to several $100s each month. To save money, she goes cold turkey. But to her surprise, she doesn't save much money in the long run. Here's how it happens. Suppose your friend's monthly disposable income expenditure is about $1,000. About half of it is spent on Starbucks. In the end of January, she decides to quit Starbucks and make coffee at home. This saves her about $500 in February. But now she has more disposable income lying around. She decides to buy something with it like books, vintage coffee mugs, etc. And she increases her spending more and more in the following months. Eventually, she completely or almost completely rebounds back to her original $1,000 a month spending habit. The study Shellenberger cites states that we consistently estimate an energy rebound effect of around 96 to 100% and a greenhouse gas rebound effect of around 50%. In other words, conversion to vegetarianism doesn't produce long-lasting environmental benefits, at least not as much as we would just from looking at the energy expenditure and emissions associated with plant versus animal agriculture. I'd like to hear what you think about the rebound effect. Finally, Shellenberger goes for the gut punch and argues that ethical and environmental vegetarianism and veganism originate from emotional reactions as opposed to rational thought. According to a group of researchers he cites, vegetarians and vegans associate meat products with death and other things that cause negative emotions, hence they are repulsed by meat products. To critically evaluate Shellenberger's accusation, we should think about a simple sounding question. What's the basis of morality? But this simple sounding question is actually complex. It contains two separate questions. First, where does moral motivation come from? Here, by moral motivation, I mean the desire or incentive to act. Moral motivation isn't the same as moral conviction. There are many people who are seriously convinced that they should do this or that, but they can't bring themselves to doing that. Think of me, for instance. I sincerely believe that I should stop playing video games and donate the time and money I spend on video games to charity. But do I stop playing video games? Do I donate to charity? No. Why? Because I suck. I lack moral motivation, at least as far as this moral belief is concerned. Then there's the question, where does moral justification come from? Justification is about the evidence and reasons one has for a belief. So moral justification is about the evidence and reasons we have for our moral beliefs. Moral justification and moral motivation aren't the same thing. Justification isn't a matter of motivation because it is not a matter of what you want. It's a matter of what's true or credible. For instance, I don't like grading. I just hate it. So my motivation to grade is typically very low. Does that mean I don't have a moral obligation to grade? Of course not. I'm morally obligated to grade your work in a timely manner, in part because it is my job, and in part because you deserve the opportunity to get feedback and see what you can do to improve your work. Now, Shellenberger accuses vegetarians and vegans of basing their moral judgments on emotions. By this, he could mean two things. They are getting their moral motivation from emotions, or they are deriving moral justification from emotions. Let's assess each possibility and see what could be wrong with it. Can emotions motivate moral behavior? Or should we shun our emotions completely when it comes to acting on our moral convictions? This man is Ted Bundy, a serial killer who kidnapped and murdered at least 30 women. One of the dominant theories about Bundy among the psychiatrists who examined him was that he had psychopathy, which is a mental condition with diminished or absent prosocial emotions and extremely poor judgment. Lacking such emotions made him behave like a monster. Indeed, there is plenty of evidence from brain science that damage to the parts of the brain processing prosocial emotions such as compassion, love, gratitude, shame, and guilt is strongly associated with poor judgment. So, emotions can motivate moral behavior. Prosocial emotions are key to morality. Without them, we can't act morally. So, the answer to the first question is clear. Moral motivation comes largely or even entirely from emotions. So, if vegetarians and vegans are being emotional in this sense, they aren't doing anything wrong. The next question is, can emotions justify moral beliefs? On this issue, there's a famous debate between two schools of thought, moral sentimentalism and moral rationalism. Moral sentimentalism is the view that emotions can justify moral beliefs. Scottish philosophers Adam Smith and David Hume are the most influential moral sentimentalists. Moral rationalists, on the other hand, think that emotions cannot justify moral beliefs. For them, the evidence and reasons for a moral belief must come from a purely rational or logical process that doesn't factor in any emotions whatsoever. The most famous moral rationalist is the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And it's clear where Shellenberger's sympathies lie. He is also a moral rationalist because he thinks that vegetarians and vegans are making a mistake by mixing emotions and moral justification. He seems right about at least part of the claim. Many ethical and environmental vegetarians and vegans justify their beliefs that we shouldn't eat animals by talking about their feelings or the feelings of the animals who are victims of the process. But is Shellenberger right about the claim that emotions can't play that role? As always, I would like to hear what you think. But taking a step back and looking at the big picture, I am a bit perplexed. This book, as far as I can tell from its introduction, is about environmental alarmism and its dangers to us and the planet. But 4 out of 5 arguments I could identify in this chapter have nothing to do with environmentalism or environmental alarmism. I suspect that Shellenberger has some serious beef, so to speak, with vegetarianism and veganism, which goes beyond his concerns about environmental alarmism. I think that's why this chapter at many points reads more like a rant and reads less like a level-headed analysis. And it's really a shame, because I think the rantiness distracts the reader from the overall message and casts suspicion about his credibility on other issues. And finally, there's the issue of nuclear waste. I already talked about it earlier in the course, and I won't repeat myself. Instead, you should watch a TED Talk by Shellenberger that summarizes his points fairly well. It is the last link in the video description. And this brings me to the end of this lecture. Send me a message if you have any questions. Thank you for your patience, and I'll catch you next time.